The grand ballroom of Ashworth Palace sparkled under crystal chandeliers, but Prince Alexander felt like he was drowning in the sea of faces. His wife, Princess Victoria, stood beside him with her practiced smile, greeting dignitaries and foreign ambassadors. To the outside world, they appeared as the perfect royal couple, but Alexander knew the truth that weighed heavily on both their hearts. Just 3 weeks ago, they had received the devastating news that would change everything. Victoria's father, the Duke of Eastmoor, had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer. The doctors gave him only months to live. Yet here they stood, fulfilling their royal duties, while their private world crumbled around them. Alexander watched as Victoria's hand trembled slightly while shaking hands with the French ambassador. Only he could see the small signs of her inner turmoil, the way she bit her lower lip when she thought no one was looking, or how she gripped his arm just a little tighter during their ceremonial walk. The evening dragged on with endless conversations about trade agreements and cultural exchanges. Alexander found himself responding automatically, his mind elsewhere. He thought about Victoria's father, a man who had become like a second father to him. The Duke had been the one to teach Alexander how to fish, how to tend to the royal gardens, and most importantly, how to truly love his daughter. During a brief moment between introductions, Victoria leaned close to Alexander's ear. Her voice was barely a whisper, but he could hear the pain behind her words. She told him that she had received another call from the hospital that afternoon. Her father was asking for them, but they couldn't leave. The royal schedule was packed for the next 2 weeks with state visits and important ceremonies. Alexander felt anger rising in his chest, not at Victoria but at the circumstances that trapped them in their golden cage. He looked around the room at all the people who expected so much from them, who saw them as symbols rather than human beings with breaking hearts. The weight of the crown felt heavier than ever before. As the evening continued, Alexander noticed small details that others missed. The way Victoria's eyes glistened with unshed tears when someone mentioned family. How she excused herself twice to step onto the balcony for fresh air, really to compose herself away from prying eyes. The careful way she avoided any conversation that might lead to questions about their personal lives. When the final guest left at midnight, the palace fell silent except for the clicking of Victoria's heels on the marble floor. Alexander followed her through the empty corridors, past portraits of previous monarchs who had faced their own struggles and sorrows. The weight of tradition and duty seemed to press down on them from every gilded frame. They reached their private quarters, and for the first time that evening, Victoria's composure finally cracked. She sat on the edge of their bed, still in her elegant gown, and buried her face in her hands. Alexander knelt beside her, taking her trembling hands in his. No words were needed. They both understood the impossible position they were in. Torn between their love for family and their obligations to the crown. The moonlight streamed through their bedroom windows, casting long shadows across the room. In that quiet moment, away from cameras and crowds, they were not the prince and princess of Ashworth. They were simply two people facing the most difficult time of their lives, holding on to each other as their world shifted beneath them. The morning sun filtered through the heavy curtains of the royal bedroom, but Victoria had been awake for hours. She sat by the window, still in her nightgown, staring out at the palace gardens where her father used to walk with her when she was a child. Those were simpler times when her biggest worry was whether her pony would behave during riding lessons. Alexander stirred in bed, immediately sensing her distress. He had learned to read her moods over their 7 years of marriage, and this morning felt different. There was a stillness about her that spoke of a decision being made. He approached her carefully, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Victoria turned to him with red-rimmed eyes that held a new determination. She had been thinking all night about what truly mattered. The royal advisors had already scheduled their morning with back-to-back meetings about the upcoming state visit from the Prime Minister of Japan. There were dress fittings, speech preparations, and protocol briefings. But her father was dying, and every day they delayed was a day they could never get back. She stood up abruptly and walked to her private phone, the one line that wasn't monitored by the palace staff. Her fingers trembled as she dialed her father's personal nurse. The conversation was brief, but devastating. Her father had been asking for her throughout the night. He was lucid now, but the doctors weren't sure how much longer his clarity would last. Alexander watched as his wife's face crumpled. With the weight of her decision, she looked at him with eyes that held both desperation and resolve. She couldn't do this anymore. She couldn't pretend that state dinners and ribbon cuttings were more important than holding her dying father's hand. The palace was already bustling with activity. Servants hurried through the corridors preparing for another day of royal obligations. The head butler knocked on their door, announcing that breakfast was served and that the royal secretary needed to brief them on the day's schedule. Victoria looked at Alexander, and in that moment they made a silent pact. Alexander answered the door and delivered a message that sent shockwaves through the palace staff. They were canceling everything. All meetings, all appearances, everything. The official reason would be given later, but for now they needed to leave immediately. The head butler's face went white with concern, knowing that such spontaneous changes could create diplomatic incidents. Within an hour, Victoria was dressed in simple clothes, jeans and a sweater that made her look like any other daughter rushing to be with her sick father. Alexander arranged for a private car, not the usual royal motorcade that would attract attention. They needed to do this quietly, away from the media circus that followed their every move. As they drove through the countryside toward the private medical facility where Victoria's father was staying, she stared out the window at the rolling hills. This was the same route she had traveled countless times as a child, going to visit her grandparents' estate. But now, she was traveling it as a woman who had learned the hard way that some things were more important than duty. Alexander reached over and took her hand, intertwining their fingers. He understood the magnitude of what they were doing. By abandoning their royal schedule, they were risking criticism from the press, disappointing foreign dignitaries, and potentially creating political complications. But sometimes, being human mattered more than being royal. The medical facility came into view, a modest building surrounded by privacy hedges. Victoria's heart began to race as they approached. She hadn't seen her father in 3 weeks, and she wasn't prepared for how much he might have changed. The doctors had warned her family about the rapid progression of his condition, but nothing could have prepared her for what awaited her inside those walls. They parked and walked hand in hand toward the entrance, two people stripped of all their royal pretenses, facing the most fundamental human experience of all, the impending loss of someone they loved more than life itself. The sterile hallway of the medical facility seemed endless as Victoria and Alexander walked toward her father's room. Each step felt heavier than the last. Victoria's hands were shaking so badly that Alexander had to guide her gently by the elbow. The smell of disinfectant and the soft beeping of medical equipment created an atmosphere that felt worlds away from the opulence of palace life. Outside room 314, they paused. Through the small window in the door, Victoria could see her father lying in the hospital bed. The man who had once seemed so strong and invincible now looked frail and small under the white sheets. His once thick hair was now thin and gray, and his face had the gaunt appearance that comes with serious illness, but his eyes were alert, staring at the ceiling as if he was deep in thought. Victoria's mother, Eleanor, sat beside the bed reading a book aloud. She had been maintaining this vigil for days, refusing to leave her husband's side except for brief moments. When she looked up and saw her daughter through the window, her face broke into the first genuine smile anyone had seen from her in weeks. Alexander squeezed Victoria's hand one final time before she entered the room. This was a moment that belonged to family, and though he was family by marriage, he understood that his wife needed these first few minutes alone with her parents. He settled into an uncomfortable chair in the hallway, watching through the window, as 3 generations of love played out in that small room. The reunion was both heartbreaking and beautiful. Victoria rushed to her father's bedside, taking his hand in both of hers. The Duke's eyes lit up when he saw his daughter, and for a moment, the years seemed to fall away from his face. He looked like the man who used to chase her around the palace gardens, who taught her to ride horses, who walked her down the aisle on her wedding day. Eleanor moved to give them space, but the Duke gestured for both women to come close. His voice was weaker than Victoria remembered, but it still carried the warmth and wisdom that had guided her throughout her life. He told Victoria how proud he was of the woman she had become, how he watched her royal duties on television and marveled at her grace under pressure. But then his tone changed, becoming more urgent. He had things to say, important things that couldn't wait. He talked about the burden of royal life, about the sacrifices he had watched his daughter make. He expressed his regret that duty had kept her away during these crucial weeks. His words weren't meant as criticism but as a father's concern for his child's happiness. Victoria broke down then, all the grief and guilt she had been holding inside pouring out in tears. She apologized for not being there sooner, for letting royal obligations keep her away when he needed her most. She confessed how trapped she felt between her love for family and her responsibilities to the crown, how she lay awake at night feeling pulled in different directions. The Duke listened with the patience of a man who had lived through his own struggles with duty and family. When Victoria finished, he shared stories from his own life, moments when he had to choose between personal desires and family expectations. He told her about times he had made the wrong choice, putting obligation before love, and how he had regretted those decisions for years afterward. Eleanor sat quietly, tears streaming down her face as she watched her husband pour his heart out to their daughter. She knew these might be among his final coherent conversations, and every word felt precious. The afternoon sun slanted through the hospital room window, creating patterns of light and shadow that seemed to emphasize the bittersweet nature of the moment. Alexander remained in the hallway, giving them privacy but staying close enough to provide support when needed. He watched palace security guards arrive and position themselves discreetly around the building. Word had gotten out about their unscheduled departure, and the royal protection team was adapting to ensure their safety, while respecting their need for family time. As evening approached, the Duke grew tired, but he fought against sleep. There was still so much he wanted to say, so many years of wisdom he wanted to pass on to his daughter. Victoria held his hand and promised him that she would stay as long as he needed her, regardless of what the palace expected. In that moment, she was not a princess but simply a daughter, and that was exactly what her father needed her to be. The second day at the medical facility brought unexpected challenges that tested Victoria and Alexander's resolve in ways they hadn't anticipated. The palace had sent the royal secretary Margaret Thornfield to personally retrieve them. She arrived with a briefcase full of urgent documents and an expression that could freeze water. Margaret had served the royal family for 30 years and had never seen such a breach of protocol. Victoria stood firm in the hospital corridor, still, wearing her simple clothes from the day before. She had spent the night in an uncomfortable chair beside her father's bed, refusing to leave even when the nurses suggested she get some rest. Her usually perfect appearance was replaced by the disheveled look of someone whose priorities had completely shifted overnight. Margaret presented a long list of consequences from their absence. The Japanese Prime Minister's advance team was confused and concerned about the sudden schedule changes. 3 different charitable organizations were scrambling to reschedule events that had been planned for months. The media was starting to ask questions about why the royal couple had vanished from public view without explanation. But what hurt Victoria most was the message Margaret delivered from the Queen herself. Her Majesty was disappointed and concerned about the precedent this behavior might set. The royal family had always maintained that personal matters, no matter how difficult, should not interfere with their duties to the country. Victoria felt the weight of generations of royal tradition pressing down on her shoulders. Alexander stepped forward to support his wife, but he could see the internal conflict tearing her apart. She was caught between 2 worlds, the woman who wanted to hold her dying father's hand and the princess who had been taught that duty always came first. The hallway fell silent except for the distant sounds of medical equipment and quiet conversations between nurses. Eleanor emerged from her husband's room with news that changed everything. The Duke had taken a turn during the night. His condition was deteriorating faster than the doctors had expected. They were estimating days now, not weeks. The medical team was doing everything possible to keep him comfortable, but the window for meaningful communication was closing rapidly. This news hit Victoria like a physical blow. She had already lost so much time to royal obligations, and now she faced the possibility of losing her father before she could say everything that needed to be said. Alexander watched his wife's face transform with a determination he had never seen before. She turned to Margaret with quiet authority and made a declaration that would change everything. Victoria announced that she was taking a leave of absence from all royal duties until after her father's funeral. She would not be returning to the palace, would not be attending any scheduled events, and would not be available for any royal functions. If this created problems, then the palace would have to find ways to work around her absence. Margaret's face went pale with shock. In 30 years of royal service, she had never heard a member of the family simply refuse their obligations. She tried to explain the complexity of royal schedules, the international implications, the damage to the monarchy's reputation. But Victoria had made her choice, and nothing Margaret said would change her mind. Alexander stepped closer to his wife. Taking her hand in a gesture of solidarity, he announced that he would be staying with Victoria throughout this difficult time. Whatever consequences they faced later, they would face together. The couple presented a united front that even Margaret's decades of experience couldn't crack. The royal secretary left with promises to relay their decision to the Queen and to begin the complicated process of managing the fallout. Victoria and Alexander were now truly on their own, having chosen love over duty in the most dramatic way possible. They returned to the Duke's room, knowing that they had burned bridges that might never be rebuilt. That afternoon brought a surprising visitor. Victoria's younger brother James arrived from his military posting in Scotland. He had requested emergency leave the moment he heard about their father's condition. Unlike Victoria, James had fewer royal obligations and more freedom to follow his heart. His arrival created a sense of family unity that had been missing during the formal palace discussions. The three siblings and their mother formed a protective circle around the Duke's bed. For the first time in years, they were together not for a royal function or state occasion, but simply as a family facing loss. The outside world seemed very far away as they shared memories, told stories, and took turns holding their father's hand. As evening fell, Alexander realized he was witnessing something extraordinary. Despite the chaos they had created in the palace, despite the disappointed officials and rescheduled events, this family had found something more valuable than duty. They had found each other again, and they were facing their grief together, rather than hiding behind royal protocol. The third morning brought both a miracle and a heartbreak that no one in the family was prepared for. The Duke had rallied overnight in a way that surprised even his doctors. His mind was clearer than it had been in weeks, and he was asking to speak with each family member individually. It was as if he had summoned every remaining bit of strength for one final gift to those he loved most. Victoria was the first to have her private conversation with her father. They talked for nearly an hour about things that had never been said aloud. The Duke shared stories from his own childhood, lessons he had learned about balancing love and duty, and his deepest hopes for his daughter's future happiness. Most importantly, he gave her permission to live her life according to her own heart, not the expectations of others. When Victoria emerged from that conversation, she looked transformed. There was a peace in her eyes that hadn't been there for months. Alexander could see that some fundamental shift had occurred, something that went beyond grief or duty. She had received her father's blessing to be authentic, to choose love over obligation when the two conflicted. James went in next, spending time talking about his military career and his plans for the future. The Duke had always worried about his son's tendency to rebel against royal expectations, but now he expressed pride in James's independence and courage. He shared wisdom about staying true to one's principles even when the world demands conformity. Eleanor's time with her husband was the most difficult to witness from outside. 43 years of marriage were condensed into quiet whispers and gentle touches. They talked about their early days together, their dreams for their children, and their gratitude for a life lived together despite all its challenges. Alexander had to turn away from the window several times, overwhelmed by the intimacy of their goodbye. The afternoon brought unexpected news from the outside world. The palace had released a carefully worded statement about Victoria and Alexander taking time for family matters. The public response was overwhelmingly supportive. People from all Walks of life were expressing understanding and even admiration for a royal couple who had chosen family over duty in their time of crisis. Letters and flowers began arriving at the medical facility from ordinary citizens who had faced similar situations with their own families. A teacher from Manchester wrote about having to choose between an important school event and her mother's final days. A businessman from Wales shared how he had learned to put family first after almost missing his father's death due to work obligations. Most surprising of all was a personal message from several other European royal families. They privately expressed support for Victoria and Alexander's choice, sharing their own struggles with balancing personal grief and public obligations. It seemed that behind the formal facades, many royal families had faced similar heartbreaking decisions. Victoria was moved to tears by this unexpected outpouring of support. She had expected criticism and condemnation for abandoning her duties. Instead, she discovered that her honest choice had touched people's hearts and reminded them of what truly mattered in life. The human story had connected with people in a way that no amount of royal protocol ever could. That evening, the Duke asked to see Victoria and Alexander together. His voice was weaker now, but his message was crystal clear. He thanked Alexander for supporting Victoria's decision to stay, for understanding that love sometimes requires difficult choices. He shared his observation that their marriage had grown stronger through this crisis, not weaker. The Duke spoke about the future, about the possibility that Victoria and Alexander might face criticism when they returned to royal life. He encouraged them to remember this time, when they had chosen authentically and found peace in their decision. He reminded them that true leadership sometimes meant setting an example of human compassion rather than rigid duty. As the night wore on, the entire family gathered in the room. The Duke was tired but peaceful, surrounded by everyone he loved most. The medical staff had dimmed the lights and made the room as comfortable as possible. Outside the window, the stars were visible in the clear night sky, creating an almost magical atmosphere for what everyone knew would be one of their last evenings together. Alexander looked around the room at this remarkable family who had taught him so much about courage and authenticity. Victoria sat holding her father's hand, no longer the conflicted princess torn between duty and love, but a daughter who had made peace with her choices. The transformation in all of them was visible and profound. The Duke passed away peacefully just before dawn on the fourth day, with his entire family surrounding his bed. His final moments were exactly as he would have wanted them, filled with love, dignity, and the presence of those who mattered most to him. Victoria held his hand as he took his last breath, and for the first time since this journey began, she felt complete peace about her choices. The immediate aftermath was a blur of arrangements and decisions. Eleanor, despite her grief, showed remarkable strength in planning a funeral that would honor her husband's memory, while respecting the family's need for privacy. She had learned from Victoria's brave example that some moments were too sacred to share with the world. Alexander took charge of managing the outside pressures, fielding calls from palace officials and media representatives, while shielding Victoria and her family from unnecessary stress. He had found his own strength through this experience, discovering that his role as a husband was far more important than his role as a prince. His protectiveness of Victoria during her grief showed a depth of character that impressed everyone around them. The funeral was held at the small chapel on the family's private estate, far from the cameras and crowds that usually attended royal events. Victoria made the controversial decision to keep it private, inviting only close family and friends who had truly known and loved her father. The palace initially objected, but Victoria's quiet determination had become impossible to argue with. During the service, Victoria gave a eulogy that moved everyone present to tears. She spoke about her father's greatest lesson, that love and authenticity were worth any sacrifice. She talked about the difficult choice she had made to abandon her royal duties in his final days, and how that decision had given them both the gift of time together. Her words were not those of a princess speaking about duty, but of a daughter celebrating a father's life. The media coverage of the funeral was surprisingly respectful, perhaps because Victoria's authentic grief was so evident, or perhaps because the public had genuinely connected with their story. The press treated the family's loss with unusual dignity. Editorial writers praised Victoria and Alexander for their courage in putting family first, calling them a new model for modern royalty. In the weeks following the funeral, Victoria and Alexander faced the challenging task of returning to royal life. The Queen requested a private meeting where she expressed her understanding of their choices, even admitting that she might have done the same thing in their situation. The royal family, it seemed, was evolving along with the times, becoming more human and less rigidly formal. Their first public appearance was at a children's hospital, an engagement they had specifically chosen because it felt meaningful rather than obligatory. Victoria looked different, more grounded, more present. She connected with the sick children and their families in a way that seemed deeper and more genuine than her previous public appearances. The experience of choosing love over duty had changed her approach to everything. Alexander noticed the change in his wife and felt proud of the woman she had become through this difficult journey. She no longer carried the constant tension between her authentic self and her royal persona. The crisis had forced her to integrate both sides of her identity, creating someone who was both more royal and more human than before. 6 months later, Victoria announced the creation of a new foundation, focused on supporting families dealing with terminal illness. The foundation's mission was to help people navigate the difficult balance between work obligations and family crises. She spoke openly about her own experience, using her platform to encourage others to make the difficult but necessary choice, to prioritize love when it mattered most. The foundation's launch event was held at the same medical facility where her father had spent his final days. Victoria and Alexander walked through the halls where they had made their most important decision, now returning as advocates for other families facing similar struggles. The circle felt complete. Their private grief had been transformed into public service that would help countless others. As they stood together at the podium, announcing the foundation's programs and goals, Victoria felt her father's presence in the room. She knew he would have been proud of how they had taken their painful experience and used it to create something meaningful for others. The difficult choice to abandon duty for love had ultimately led them to a deeper understanding of what true service really meant. Alexander squeezed Victoria's hand as she concluded her speech, both of them understanding that they had found something rare and precious, a way to be authentically themselves while still honoring their responsibilities to others. They had learned that sometimes the most royal thing to do was to be completely, honestly human.